Hey there team, welcome back. Barry Watson here, Wild Mountain Man, where today we're going to try to solve one of wild camping's most ancient mysteries, and that is how on earth to find the most ideal tent for whatever purpose you want it for. So if you're ready, let's go. So what I'd like to share with you are 10 criteria that you can use for determining the best tent for you, whether you're going by yourself, whether you're going with someone else, whether you're going for one night, whether you're going for multiple nights, whether you're going on a 3-season trip, whether you're going on a 4-season trip. The 10 things that I'm going to share in a few minutes will be really helpful for you. And make sure you stay to the end, as I've got a super easy tool I'd like to share with you that'll really help make the whole decision making process around what's the best tent for you far more simpler and hassle free. The first criteria on a tent that you may choose is colour. You may want a tent that blends in. You may want a tent that's very bold and contrasts against whatever environment it's pitched in. For me, for a 4-season tent, I like my Ferrari red looking tent. Why? Because it looks great in photos, and of course in adverse weather and I need to get rescued, it's easy for rescuers to see. Where on the other hand, in the summer, I've got a green tent. It blends in. So you've got a choice. If you've got a choice where you can choose between different colours, colour can be a determinant. Number 2, let's continue to focus on the outside of the tent, where now we're going to zoom in on the strength of the fabric. Now the strength of the fabric, whether it be the outside of the tent, whether it be the inner of the tent, or whether it be the tub or the floor of the tent, is measured in what we call denier. Denier equals the strength, the thickness of the fabric at a light end, at a very not a very strong end. You got about a 10 denier up to about a 70 denier. A 70 denier would be a very strong fabric. It's obviously a bit heavier because it's stronger. So you've got to find that happy medium between that which is strong on the outside, but also that which is fairly lightweight. And as much as you can go from an extreme of 10 at the lowest end to a thicker end of 70, you probably want to have a denier of around about 30D to 40D. That'll be a good balance between those two things. And of course, you also, in terms of the outside of the tent and its strength, you want to keep in mind you're trying to get a fabric which is called a ripstop. It's got those crisscrosses on it in terms of the fabric design, which gives it more strength, and if it does tear slightly, it's not going to tear beyond reasonable amount. Number 3 is waterproofness. Is waterproofness even a word? In terms of waterproofness, tents are measured in what's called hydrostatic head. Now the hydrostatic rating of a tent is measured in millimeters. The bigger the number, the better it is. So at the top end, you've got a tent that's around about 5,000 millimeters in terms of hydrostatic head. That's a very watertight and very waterproof tent. At the other end, you may have a tent that literally could be 1,000, 1,500 millimeters. It's still going to help you in some areas, but it certainly isn't as good. I would suggest if you're looking for a tent in terms of waterproofness, you really want to look around 2,000, 2,500 millimeters as a starting point. The tents that I've got are either 3,000 or 5,000, so certainly at the upper end. Number 4 is about pegs, poles and guy lines. I'm going to wrap them all together. The good thing is though that if you find a tent that you like and the pegs and the poles and the guy lines aren't really up to scratch, you can pimp them, you can beef them up. You can put a DAC pole in, which I suggest is one of the best poles out there. South Korean made aluminium pole, very strong, and most times very lightweight, and it gives good balance between weight and strength. The pegs, MSR are obviously very good with pegs, and there's a number of pegs, and there's obviously different manufacturers of guy lines, but you want to get as best as you can, and that's fine if they're not quite up to par, because you can get extra poles or a stronger pole. You can replace the guy lines, and also similarly you can replace the pegs. So not a great determinant, but something to consider: pegs, poles and guy lines as you're looking for your next tent. So let's move inside the tent now. Now one of the things that you obviously want to look at is the inner tub. Now the inner floor or tub, it can range from 15,000 hydrostatic head right down to literally 2,000, 3,000 or perhaps even less. I would suggest that the closer you can get to 10,000 would be the better. However, if you find a tent that you really like and the tub isn't as strong or as watertight, you can add a footprint or you can add like a blue tarp underneath, which will help complement the strength and the watertightness of that. In terms of exact space, I generally find for me that a 2 meter square is enough for me. And I generally also find that if you want to have somebody else with you, another 50% of that, like another square meter per person, is generally enough. And I'm almost 6 feet, so having that sort of space gives me a bit of room to stretch out and also to get my elbows out and not sort of feel as though that somebody's breathing upon me every time I move. One thing though to be mindful of when looking at the inside of a tent, especially when you look on the internet at the specifications of that the manufacturer or the retailer may give in terms of the footprint of the tent, you may think, oh, that's long enough. Just be conscious though of the ends, which you might find which may slope at one end or the other. And so you've got to look at not only what the floor plan says, but what we call the usable space of the tent. Just because it may be 2.2 meters or 2.3 meters in length doesn't mean you can use all of that. The slopes may mean that your head may hit the sides, or your feet in terms of the end of your sleeping bag may hit the end, and sometimes you just don't want that, especially if you get condensation in your tent. So make sure you look for the usable space, not just what the floor plan says. Okay, as we move right along, the next important factor and buying criteria is vestibule, not vegetable, vestibule space. You want enough space in your tent between the outer and the inner to be able to put such things as your boots, as your pack. If it's adverse weather, you obviously want to be able to have enough space in it to cook in. So roughly about 0.6 of a meter, and I'll do the conversion here for you as well who aren't on metric. So that's something to consider. Anything bigger than 0.6 of a square meter is great, but I'll suggest probably not too little, otherwise you are going to have some difficulties cramming everything in and having a space that's comfortable and also workable. Number 7 is the type of tent it is. Do you want a tent that pitches what's called a single pitch or a multi-pitch? A single pitch is a tent where you firstly got to stick up the inner, you peg it out, you pole it out, and then you put the outer on top. Now that's great in terms of the weather's fine, but what happens if it's blowing a gale, or what happens if it's pouring rain? As soon as you start putting up that mesh tent, that's going to allow the water to get in, and you're going to have a wet tent before you've even started. So some people like to have what's called a multi-pitch tent. In other words, the outside, the fly or the inner are connected together by elastic toggles, which means that they go up together. So in terms of when it's blowing or when it's wet, you aren't going to get the inner wet because the outer goes up together with the inner, and it saves hassle and also saves you time. The next factor is the type of tent that you're looking at. Let me show you what I mean. When it comes to the structure of a tent, they can be divided into 3 categories. One is freestanding. Freestanding means it can stand by itself. This poles, the structure of the tent, enable it to stand there without it being guided out. You do not need to peg it out. It'll stand as it is. Now, obviously in terms of wind and structure and making sure it stays in the same place, you do want to guide out, but in some ways you don't have to if you don't want to. The other way is self-supporting. What that means is that the body of the tent can stand by itself, but either end of the tent, the vestibules, have to be supported and held up by pegs. And the third way is neither freestanding nor self-supporting. In other words, if it's pegged out, it'll stand up. If it's not pegged out, it's going to collapse on you or anybody else in it. Okay, number 9, almost there. Number 9 is quite a weighty one, pun intended, because number 9 is weight. How much weight do you want to carry? Whether it be a 1-person tent, a 2-person tent, a 3 or 4 season tent, weight is always a factor, unless you're at Ox. I'm not an ox. I'm strong, but I'm not that strong. And so you got to determine what sort of weight that you want. Now that's going to be factored in by a lot of things in terms of the size of it. Do you want a 4-season tent? And as I said before, with a 4-season tent, you are going to have a tent that is going to be weightier than a 3-person tent. So decide what you want. I know there's tents that are literally well under 1 kilogram, and you get tents that are sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 times that sort of weight. So determine the type of application that you're going to go into, the type of fabric, the thickness of the fabric, the type of poles that you want, because that's all going to constitute to the weight that's contributed to the tent that you ideally want. The 10th and the last factor, and this is an important one for many people, and that's the price. I mean, literally, you can go to a big box store and you can get a non-branded type one, and you can literally pay under $100. But also, you can get one like I've got one, 4-season, 1-person tent that I paid well over 1,000 New Zealand dollars for. So it depends on your priorities, it depends where you're taking it, it depends on your stage of life, your budget, etc., etc. But obviously price is a factor that you need to consider when you're looking at buying your next ideal tent. So as I was trying to determine the very best tent for me, I found it quite difficult, to be honest. There was this tent that had this feature that was really good, then you look at another feature of the tent, oh, it wasn't as good, and other tents were better, and oh, I was like, oh, I was doing my head in. So what I did, amongst the 10 things I've just shared with you, I narrowed it down to my top 5. My top 5 were weight, price, waterproofness, internal space area, and vestibule space. And what I did is I put them down the left hand column, and then I rated all the tents that I was potentially looking at that were in my options list, if you will, and I scored each of the 5 things, each 5 criteria, the factors that were most important to me, out of 10. And then what I did was able to objectively, and a bit of subjectivity thrown in there as well, work out with the total weighting of each score what was the best all-round tent for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that that's helped you. I hope that you've been able to get some good tips and good criteria for the next tent that you're going to get. Can I please ask if you can subscribe to the channel? That way you get first notifications of all the other great and helpful wild camping and other associated videos I bring out. And I'd love to be able to keep in contact. So if you've got any questions or comments or any feedback, please put them in the comments. I'll look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, rock on team. Bye.